Well, welcome everyone to the DeFord lecture series. My name is Elizabeth Catlos, and I'm a faculty member in the Department of Geological Sciences in the Jackson School of Geosciences at UT Austin. This is our departmental seminar series, the DeFord lecture series. It has been a requirement and tradition for all graduate students in the department since the late 1940s. The lecture series is named after Professor Roland DeFord, who joined the department in 1948 with the purpose of enhancing the graduate program in the department. Today's speaker will be introduced by Assistant Professor Daniela Rempe. Thank you.
Thanks, Liz. So I'm delighted to introduce Jenny Druhan, who's an assistant professor and Helen Crowley Petit Scholar at the University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign. She completed her BS in environmental science at UNC in 2003 and went on to get her master's from the University of Arizona in hydrogeology. She completed her PhD with Don DePaulo at Berkeley and then completed a postdoc with Kate Monner at Stanford. So as a result of all that training, Jenny is a Goldilocks of a geoscientist. She and her group run experiments in the field, in her isotope lab, and using sophisticated reactive transport models, and put all of that together to teach us about how water flow paths, water chemistry, and minerals all co-evolve in the near surface. So that group is solving important problems like using lithium isotopes to identify how trees and their roots break apart rock and form soils. We're using sulfur isotopes to identify how best to remediate nuclear waste, or using silicon isotopes to identify controls on silicate weathering rates, and I could go on and on and on. She may be known to some of you for sharing her knowledge through short courses on Geochemist Workbench, CrunchFlow, CrunchTope, all these codes that her group is actively contributing to in fun and innovative ways using new isotope systems, considering new representations of flow and transport that interest many of you, like heterogeneity across scales and fractures. And so I want to thank Jenny for joining us today. You can take it from here.
Great, Daniela, can you see the slide properly? Are we good?
Yeah.
Okay, great. Well, thank you so much for that introduction. That was very generous of you, and thank you for the invitation, and all of you for taking some time to talk with me this afternoon. I want to start off by making sure to highlight two of the contributors to the work that you'll see today, John Gola and Allison Toon, both exceptional PhD students, John at UIUC with me, and Allison, you must recognize, one of your very own at the Jackson School. So some of the results that you'll see towards the end of the talk are really because of them. And so I'll make sure to highlight their contributions. I've also fit in as many other contributors as I could into this line. Certainly there are more, and I'll do my best to make it clear when and where they've helped out. And thank you, of course, to Daniela for being now a long-term and vital collaborator to my research program. I will also admit that this is a vague talk title, and that's because I was trying to decide right up to the last minute between two topics. And one of them would have been maybe a more traditional contaminant hydrology reactive transport type talk. But I decided to go out on a limb a little bit today and tell you a bit more about recent work that I've been involved in, trying to take some of these reactive transport principles and apply them to new settings, and in particular, the more long-term behavior of water, rock, and life interactions in the critical zone. So I said the word critical zone, which inherently requires this illustration. It always gets used. It's just that good. So shout out to John Shorover and colleagues for creating this. And I really like the cartoon, not only because it gives us a sense of this sort of thin veneer or skin of the earth that we live on and draw resources from, but it also gives us a sense of the vertical structure that we think of this critical zone as partitioning across. And so we'll just highlight two really important critical zone functions. One of them that, at least according to this cartoon, happens in the very shallowest layers of soil. And that involves essentially the interaction of organisms with the atmosphere to photosynthesize and fix carbon. That organic carbon comes into the shallow soil layers as some sort of input and is then respired or consumed by microbial populations, moderated or mediated by the availability of water and other factors to get converted back to CO2 which is then re-emitted to the atmosphere. And so this basic balance between photosynthesis and respiration is a really important regulator for global carbon cycling, and something that we really need to carefully understand in order to accurately predict how climate will change. Meanwhile, at least according to this cartoon, much deeper underground, deep in the critical zone, is an entirely different world where water interacts with rock. And when we're talking about rock here, what we really mean is something more coherent, closer to bedrock, full of primary minerals that are less stable near the Earth's surface. So these water rock interactions are going to be converting these primary minerals into secondary phases, typically clays. Now you can see that I kind of wrote this in a particular way because I wanted to really emphasize the point that these two processes, though apparently spatially segregated, are really obviously linked because they all involve CO2. And so from this very friendly cartoon perspective, we can see that there has to be coupling across this structure of the critical zone. Now, typically when we're trying to build models and think quantitatively about these soil carbon respiration and mineral formation processes, we tend to hold one of them as sort of simplified or static while we study the other one in detail. So let me show you how that typically works. So we're going to dive into these soil mineral weathering reactions first. And this gives me a really fun opportunity to show you the kind of modeling that I love to work with. So don't be afraid of the PDE, it's here to be our friend. This is just essentially saying that the change in concentration of anything, some solute in fluid through time, is going to be the result of how it's moved in the fluid due to flow, how it mixes in the fluid across concentration gradients, and then all sorts of different reactions that could influence it. And the ones that we're thinking about in particular right now are nominally reactions between fluid and minerals. So if we're going to model something like this weathering front, this conversion of coherent unweathered bedrock into something more like soil, then we're looking across this section of the critical zone in this sort of cartoon framework. And what I've done here is I've basically built a toy, and I love to do this with these reactive transport models, to set up a little thought exercise with the models. And so you can see this time derivative in the equation, and what that means is that we're going to have to give the model an initial condition, somewhere to start. And so in this case, I've just made a primary mineral assemblage. Basically, I was trying to mimic something like a granite, and I highlight a few of the minerals that are present in the simulation. You can see that I chose arbitrarily to make this thing 10% potassium feldspar initially. I also chose to include gibbsite, but there's no gibbsite in there to start with. It's just a phase that could form. Obviously, if you weather K-spar, you don't make gibbsite. So that's a hint that this is just a couple of many minerals that are included in the simulation. You can also do this instead of in terms of mineral volumes, in terms of elemental content. So you can see how much potassium and how much silicon is in the simulation when we start. And now what's going to happen is I'm going to launch this model forward in time and basically let water infiltrate across the upper boundary of this model and flow down through this assemblage of primary minerals and react along the way using rate laws and parameter values that people have worked really hard to constrain. And at the same time, I'm also going to be slowly supplying more fresh weatherable bedrock at the base of the domain moving up and eroding a small amount of this weathered material off the top. And so between all of those balances, we're going to try to reach a stable solution. Here we are somewhere along the way. So I've let the model advance forward in time, and things are kind of working themselves out at this point. What you can see is that we've lost a whole bunch of this primary feldspar up near the top because all that water is coming in and dissolving it. But you can see that we have more feldspar near the base of the domain because of that slow uplift and supply of fresh bedrock. You can see the same thing in the potassium, something kind of similar in the silicon, but silicon's getting influenced by a lot of other minerals also present in the system. You can see some really fun wiggles, some fun nonlinearities that appear in these models as this secondary mineral among a variety of other secondary minerals kind of battle it out in terms of who gets to form in these locations in the simulation. But eventually we hit something that's really pretty smooth and stable and at a steady state, where we've reached a balance between how quickly this reactive water is coming in, how quickly we're supplying fresh weatherable material from below, and how quickly all of the reactions are taking place in the interior. I have not said anything about carbon in a while now, and the whole preamble to this thought exercise was, what about carbon? So in this particular case, the carbon is certainly present. I showed you in the stoichiometry of those weathering reactions a few slides ago that you need CO2 to drive these reactions. And in this particular case, essentially what we're doing is I'm setting water infiltrating into the top boundary condition of this model that's already equilibrated with a high PCO2. In other words, I've assumed that this water has made it through the shallow soil layers, and along the way, it's picked up a bunch of carbonic acid, and it's really ready to react with these minerals. So I'm basically approximating all the variety of things that happen in shallow soils as high PCO2 boundary condition. And that's pretty typical of the way that we set up these kind of weathering models. It's also not altogether unreasonable to do. This is a typical soil profile, and you can see that there is indeed a very rich organic layer near the surface in the upper tens of centimeters. And then somewhere much further down, there are these mineral conversion and weathering reactions taking place. So if we now turn our attention to the carbon side of the story, we're up here in the shallower subsurface. You can see that these depth profiles are only going down to a little over a meter. And what I illustrate here are just very typical profiles of the total amount of carbon that you will find in these upper tens of centimeters of most soils, and also the age or radiocarbon content of that carbon. And so the thing to point out here is that you can see we're losing a lot of soil carbon quickly, but it's not all gone. There's a little bit left. It seems to be pretty stable, and it's pretty old. So this implies that soils can store carbon, and this is really important to us if we're trying to understand when, where, and why that stored carbon might actually become released as CO2, which could have very significant impacts in terms of climate. And so in general, when we're working in this sort of soil carbon world, we tend to use models that look a little like this. Basically, we have cut off the bottom of this weathering profile. We don't care what's going on below about a meter in most cases. And again, we're looking at this balance between inputs and then some sort of typically first order conversion back to CO2. And I think if you just sort of play with this equation in your mind and roll it around a little bit, you can convince yourself that it's going to be really hard to get this thing to do something like this, right? There's nothing built into that equation that's going to tell this model, store some carbon, protect it, don't let it get converted back to CO2. And so there's been a lot of work by a lot of really intelligent researchers trying to make better carbon models for this shallow subsurface critical zone. So this is a little bit, intentionally complicated, but it's an expansion to what maybe some of us would now recognize as a more typical soil carbon cycling model. And maybe the first thing to point out is that it's still basically in and out, coming from the surface and going back out to the atmosphere. And there's been a whole lot of work focused on a variety of different factors in these feedbacks. For example, some people are getting really excited about basically using advanced new characterization techniques to come up with all the different varieties of organic carbon compounds that occupy soil carbon stocks. And from a modeler's perspective, that kind of puts a knot in your stomach because it means that you're going to need parameters to describe reactivity for every single one of these classifications. So there's a lot going on there. There's another world of people that are getting really interested in ways in which the soil itself actually stabilizes or protects organic carbon from conversion to CO2. So the whole idea here that somehow soil aggregates can occlude or hold and protect organic carbon from microbial decomposition, that carbon can become somehow associated with mineral surfaces, that offers another form of protection. And so beginning to understand that the mineralogy that this soil respiration cycle is taking place in isn't just some sort of background framework, but is actually playing an active role. And finally, others trying to do a better job of parameterizing physical constraints on CO2 or soil carbon respiration to CO2, for example, here trying to offer a more quantitative metric for how the availability of water impacts the activity of microbial populations. So that is a whole wild world of soil carbon modeling. And we've also seen a related but not entirely overlapping world of mineral weathering modeling. And it's becoming clear in both cases that, you know, it's maybe not the best way to proceed to leave these two worlds as sort of separated from one another, or that is to say, simplifying one to extremely limited descriptions while we study the other in detail. So I am 15 slides or so in, and I've gotten to the point, and it's actually a really simple one that we're going to try to follow for the remainder of today. And that is, our soil carbon respiration and soil mineral weathering formation models compatible? And the whole premise that I'm going to run with is that mineral weathering reactions both host and record the dynamics of carbon respiration and storage in landscapes. And so if we are able to combine them into a single forward predictive modeling framework that describes both of these processes across the wide range of timescales that they operate, then we stand to learn much more about these systems than we can when we study them in isolation from one another. And so the plan for the rest of the conversation today is to step through 3 little vignettes of studies that I've been involved in very recently. Everything you're going to see here is submitted and in review, and none of it's out. So hopefully in the next month or two, something like that, a lot of this will start popping up. But for now, just a little bit of a taste of what I've been doing very recently. So the first thing we'll look at is literally an example of whether or not soil weathering and carbon storage models are compatible with one another. We're going to try and mash the two of them together and see what it takes. Then once we've got a model that combines these two sort of worlds, we're going to start using it in new and fun applications. And the one that I'll highlight today has to do with the weathering of karst and how carbon isotopes propagate into speleothem records. And then finally, very quickly, we're going to consider situations in which the weathering reactions that convert bedrock into something more like soil are happening in locations that are contemporaneous with soil carbon respiration, or I guess say subsurface organic carbon respiration. That is where we can't assume this spatial segregation between carbon reactions going on in the shallow critical zone and weathering reactions going on in the deep critical zone, but rather where they happen at the same location and what that means to us. So we've got some work to do, and we're going to jump right in. So this mashup of soil weathering and carbon respiration models. To explore this idea, we're going to go to California. And in particular, what you're looking at here on the left is an image of the marine terraces near Santa Cruz, California. This is an amazing natural laboratory. Over geologic time, there's been a sequence of events that have caused the landscape in this location to emerge or uplift out of the sea at various moments in time. And what that means is that you basically get what's called a chronosequence of levels of the landscape that have had longer to start forming soils than the ones that they are surrounded by. So it's a true natural laboratory to study the progression of weathering reactions that convert rock into soil. And because it's so useful, a lot of people have worked here. Art White, Sue Brantley, Kate Maher, lots of people have really spent a long time studying weathering reactions. Now, what I thought was really interesting is that actually a soil carbon specialist got involved in this whole story as well. And that was my colleague, Corey Lawrence, who works for the USGS. And he started taking one of these reactive transport models, actually quite similar to the little example or toy we played with a few slides ago when we were looking at weathering reactions. And he started asking, well, what happens if organic carbon is also present in this model? Quite similar to the kind of questions that I'm trying to address. And so I've shown you actually this soil profile for a while now, and actually this is Santa Cruz, so you're quite familiar with the field site already. And this is Corey's model. And essentially what's happening here is that in the solid lines, what you're seeing is the removal or weathering of a primary mineral, in this case, albite. So 50, 100, 200, 300,000 years of weathering. And the ingrowth of secondary phases in the dashed lines, in this case, kaolinite. And part of what is driving this weathering profile is that Corey is allowing the water that's infiltrating across the top of this domain to enter containing some concentration of low molecular weight organic acid, an organic carbon. In this case, he's using oxalate just sort of as a nominal species to track, but it could be a variety of different compounds. The key here is that this organic carbon is available to be converted to CO2. So you can see that we're losing that organic carbon quickly over like the first meter of the profile. But where that organic carbon is present, you can see this really strong ingrowth of those secondary clays. And the reason that that's happening is that this organic carbon can actually also complex or zorb onto the primary mineral surfaces and drive what we would refer to as ligand promoted dissolution. That was a mouthful. All it really means is that the presence of this organic acid is making these weathering reactions more favorable. And so you can actually also see the amount of this organic that's stuck onto those primary mineral surfaces. And you can see that that decreases through time as we run out of these primary minerals in the location of the model where this organic acid is really prevalent. So yeah, right? I mean, he's already done it. I don't need to do anything. It did seem like in some sense, this was the model that I was looking for. And so I got really excited to start working with Corey. And basically there was really only one more step. And that was, well, can this same model also store soil organic carbon? And if you remember these profiles that we were looking at a few slides ago of how carbon content and age change with depth, once again, I kind of snuck this in on you. These are data from Santa Cruz. So this is the kind of data that we want to show occurring in this upper 1 meter of the same reactive transport simulation. So the only thing that I'm going to do is take this model, and rather than simulating carbon in each of its phases as just C, we're going to simulate 3 different carbons in each and every phase. We're going to simulate the 12C isotope, that's the very common isotope. We're going to simulate the 13C rare stable isotope, and we're going to simulate the very rare 14C isotope subject to radioactive decay. So we're just breaking every single reaction that involves carbon out into 3 pieces and modeling them simultaneously. And when we do this sort of isotope enabled simulation, then we're able to directly track how the age or retention of this carbon occurs across space and time in the same model framework. So some of you are probably thinking this isn't going to work. So I'm going to stop holding this straw man up any longer, and I'm going to deliver the difficult news that indeed this approach of simply putting radiocarbon into this modeling framework obviously is not capable of creating storage or old radiocarbon less than fraction modern stocks of carbon in the soil. So you can see here, the measured values go down to as far as like 20% of modern values. Here they go from 1 down to 1-ish. Essentially, there's absolutely no time for radiocarbon to become old in this system. In the fluid phase, I think that makes a lot of intuitive sense because this is a dissolved organic acid. If it doesn't get converted to CO2, then it's going to keep flowing in the fluid phase at the rate of average annual drainage through these soils, and it's going to leave the bottom of the system in a time scale or a travel time equivalent to the travel time of the fluid. Now, here's where I'm going to start having a little bit of an interesting conversation with soil carbon folks. And that is that in this model, the sorbed carbon on these mineral surfaces does exactly the same thing. Here is a moment where, to put a positive light on it, from reactive transport principles versus from soil carbon principles, we get to have an interesting conversation. A soil carbon specialist would say to me at this point, well, okay, that means that the exchange rate between the aqueous carbon and the carbon that's stuck on these mineral surfaces is too fast. And they're right, definitely, it is way too fast. In fact, it's instantaneous. And the reason it's instantaneous is that from a reactive transport, contaminant hydrology land, the way that exchange reactions are modeled is instantaneous, partition coefficients, isotherms. And in fact, if you go into the literature, what small amount of information is available for organic acids indicates that these organics also follow Langmuir isotherm models when they sorb onto soils. So I literally have no ability to justify putting some sort of rate dependent, time dependent coefficient on the exchange between what's stuck on the mineral surfaces and what's in the fluid. I could do it for sure, but it would be a black box parameter. I am not saying that it's wrong. In fact, I think it's definitely true that somehow sticking onto mineral surfaces protects carbon, but I think it's a wide open, big need in the community to actually parameterize the rates at which that carbon exchanges so that we can build it into models. For the time being, I don't think I can justify it. And so I've left this exchange reaction, just like I would describe exchange for anything else in a reactive transport framework. It's instantaneous, which basically means that the age of what's stuck on the mineral surfaces is the same as the age of what's in the fluid because they're in constant communication with each other. Okay, so what are we going to do? Well, I'm going to say two things that are probably pretty obvious. One, I need a carbon that's moving slower than the fluid. I need a carbon in this model that takes longer to transit this system than fluid drainage rates. And two, I need that carbon to be isolated from instantaneous exchange with the fluid in order to get that radiocarbon to age. So I'm going to take a step back from what is honestly a pretty complicated model with all of the different mineral weathering reactions, all of the surface sorption parameters and all the rest of it. And I'm just going to go once again to one of these sort of toy models. I think you're probably picking up on the fact that I really like these sort of thought experiment models. And I'm going to see if I can build in a carbon that acts more like a particulate or a solid phase. So once again here, I'm showing you initial conditions. So now, in addition to the oxalate, that's the dissolved organic acid that we've been thinking about so far, and the CO2 that gets generated from mineralizing or respiring that organic acid, I'm also going to have a solid phase carbon. The oxalate is coming in from the top in the fluid as fluid percolates down through the soil. The solid phase carbon is also coming in from the top in a burial term. Think of it as encapsulating the entirety of litter decomposing, roots growing in, biomass dying and turning over. Everything that you could think of as sort of nominally a solid phase organic is getting incorporated into this delivery of what I'm going to call POC, just for the sake of conversation today in this model. And I'm going to start off with some amount of POC in the system, a little over 4%, and everybody's radiocarbon modern. I'm going to let this thing move forward in time. Again, tracking all three isotopes of carbon, making sure that the radiocarbon decays in every single phase it exists in. And we're going to go out to about 1,000 years. And so what you see is that the amount of the solid phase carbon is decreasing. It's being consumed as it's solubilized and converted into low molecular weight organics like oxalate. So essentially this consumption is this production. So you can see there's a lot of organic acids now in the system. And there's a lot of CO2 because that organic acid is being converted to the gas phase. Everything's getting a little older. Moving out even further in time, 5,000 years, and you can see that we've lost a lot of that solid phase. So it's really only making it down to the first few meters under this rate of application at the surface before it's basically run out. Because there's so little of that solid phase in most of the system, there's not that much of this organic acid and there's not that much CO2. And finally, we reach steady state. Once again, a balance between the supply rate of each of these phases to the top of the domain, the decay and decomposition within. I chose an application rate, a burial rate of this solid phase encapsulating everything, litter, roots, biomass, everything that you could think of as solid carbon, such that I ought to reach 1 radiocarbon half-life in 2 meters. And just as a reality check, at 2 meters, if we go down to the radiocarbon, indeed, we're at about 50%. So it's working, at least in terms of the basics of how to differentiate between application rates, reaction rates, and decay internal to the system. There's a lot going on in here, more than we can necessarily unpack at this point, but I just want to point out some really interesting features, like at the top in this upper meter or 2 of the soil profile, there's more organic acids being formed because of the solubilization of the particulate phase. As we get down, there's less because they're being consumed and converted to CO2 and there's no particulate phase left. You wind up with contemporaneous distributions of very, very old solid phase carbon and less old fluid phase and gas phase carbon as a result of that balance of supply to each of these phases. Actually, this is sort of a dynamic steady state, meaning that if you perturbed this system in some way from this black stable line, you could get interesting responses. For example, if you increase the solubilization rate of POC in the system, you could actually knock the organic acid values into more negative radiocarbon values, which is kind of starting to speak to some recent sort of, I guess you could say, high impact publications suggesting that things like agricultural practices are causing apparent lower radiocarbon values of riverine organic carbon. So it's exciting to see all of this sort of behavior emerging from what is actually a really simple model framework. Anyway, so way too excited about that. So I'm going to take this basic structure and I'm going to put it back into the Santa Cruz models. So what could go wrong? I freely admit that I literally got to the point where I was setting up the input files for the model and I said, oh no, I have a huge problem. That is that this little thought exercise model that we just went through, where we're delivering this solid phase organic carbon to the top, sort of a burial or ingrowth term of everything organic that's coming from the surface, means that this solid has to go down into the profile. Everything at the Santa Cruz site, all of the prior reactive transport models that Kate Maher, that Corey Lawrence, that lots of people have worked on, are uplifting bedrock from the base of the domain to supply material for these weathering fronts to develop. So I have a huge problem. I've actually never heard of a reactive transport model that could bury one solid phase and uplift and erode another. Typically, when we're thinking about these kind of systems, we're thinking either, okay, burial like a marine sediment profile where it's just, raining sediment onto the top of that seafloor and compacting as you go down, or it's uplift of some upland tectonically active system that's eroding. No one's ever had to move one mineral down and the other mineral up. And so we literally went into the software for the open source CrunchFlow and CrunchTope reactive transport software and made some modifications to allow each solid phase to move at its own rate and in fact in its own direction, so that porosity in any given location is essentially just the sum of the volume fractions, 1 minus the sum of the volume fractions of each mineral phase, regardless of how it arrived there. So that was a really fun thing to get to update. And now we're actually ready to deliver carbon down into a system that is otherwise supplying bedrock material up. And once again, I went crashing into this and just made the values equal and opposite. And I did it in such a way that the amount in dashed lines and the radiocarbon age in solid lines of this particulate organic carbon, the solid phase, looked about right? You're losing most of your carbon over the first meter and it's aging along the way. Similarly, for the oxalate, the organic acid, you're losing most of what's there in the first meter and it's aging along the way. So things look really good. Except that when I make the uplift or supply of mineral phases equal and opposite to that, I am essentially blowing bedrock right up to the surface of this model. There is no capacity for this model to form soil. It's just moving too quickly. So it's as if there's no soil there. So in a way, this modeling exercise kind of, at least for me, taught me something that was obvious once I thought about it carefully. And that was that carbon has to get delivered downward into soil at a rate that is faster than erosion and uplift are removing that upper soil layer, or else you can't get the carbon in. And so in general, what we find for the reaction parameter values and infiltration rates of fluid in the Santa Cruz system, that about a 2 order of magnitude difference is necessary in how quickly we're delivering carbon into the top of the domain versus how quickly we're supplying bedrock from the base and eroding from the top in order to get what is now, I think, a unified model that demonstrates everything that we asked for. It's storing and aging carbon, as well as creating mineral profiles where these weathering profiles are driven in part by the presence of those organic acids, as well as the CO2 that's created as they're respired. So really excited to see this get used. And so we're gonna take a step now from this sort of thought experiment of how to get these models to function correctly with one another into an application. So we're gonna pivot a little bit. Okay, so deep breath. And next topic related is the application of this type of carbon isotope enabled reactive transport modeling to, in this case, a karst environment. So we've left California, we are in Tennessee near Nashville, and you are looking at the distribution of a cave system that my colleague at Vanderbilt, Jessica Oster, has done a really marvelous job of instrumenting and now creating a long-term monitoring data set. From the entrance of the cave over here, just to give you a sense of what you're up against, it takes about 3 hours to work your way back to this location here called the cathedral room. It's a little bit like rock climbing, but you're trying to go forwards instead of up. It's scrambling and hanging on to strange surfaces and even squeezing under very tight spaces. And it's really a marvelous thing to get to try out. And she was very kind to take me. She was also very kind to let me work with her extraordinary data set. So she has instrumented gas monitoring systems above the cathedral room, as well as collected drip waters and speleothem within the cave itself. And from all of this work, she's been able to essentially document, as you might expect, that the inorganic carbon, now we're talking about the DIC, the inorganic carbon CO2, and all of the different species that CO2 manifests as in dissolved fluids, so bicarbonate, CO3 2-, all of this is essentially looking organic in its delta 13C value, and it's all modern. The karst itself is basically a dirty carbonate. It's filled with a bunch of different impurities. And when we get down into the drips themselves, there's 2 groups. Some of them flow all the time slowly. They tend to be a little bit older. They tend to have delta 13C values a little bit closer to positive numbers or a little bit closer to the karst. There are also flashy or fracture drips that only flow some of the time. They tend to be a little bit more negative in their isotope ratio, a little bit closer to those surface organic values and a little bit younger. So we started asking whether or not we could simulate this progression of carbon and its isotopes from the soil into the cave. And in order to do that, we started off, well, to be perfectly honest, we started off realizing that we had a lot of free parameters to get under control. And so one way to alleviate at least some of those difficulties was to literally take a piece of the limestone from the system back to the laboratory, run very controlled dissolution experiments where we track the progression in time through which water solubilizes the minerals in the solid phase. And we can actually fit rate laws to this that give us both the thermodynamics and the kinetic rate constant describing dissolution of this solid phase in particular. So run with me for just a second under the premise that we've got the chemistry more or less under control. We still have a lot of things that we have to consider. I'm going to think about two major factors that are unknown or at least poorly constrained. One is, what is the PCO2 in the soil above this cave? And the other is, how quickly is water flowing through the karst above this cave? So we're going to look at sort of a sensitivity test. Okay, so what you are looking at here are three different simulations. Black is fast flow rate, green is moderate, blue is slow. Fast, medium, and slow meaning upper, middle, and lower boundary conditions of what the infiltration rate through the karst ought to be for this system. And I am using, in this case, a high soil PCO2, one of the highest values of soil PCO2 that we measure at the location. And what you see is that if we just slap the parameters for the reactivity that we constrained in the lab into this model and run it, then in yellow down here, what we find is good comparison between the model results and the values of calcium concentration in the drip waters emerging in this cave. So great, that's awesome. Except that you can see that we're dissolving a lot of calcium in the system. In fact, we're actually equilibrating with the limestone after only a few meters in the simulation. And what that means is that we're bringing a lot of limestone into the solubilized fluid phase. And along with that limestone comes a whole lot of radiocarbon, dead carbon. And so the problem is, if we match the calcium, that is enough dissolution to bring calcium concentrations up, then we get radiocarbon values of the dissolved inorganic carbon that are way too low, just absolutely not in agreement with anything that we measure in the drip waters of the cave. Okay, let's consider or continue our little exploration of parameter values. I'll keep the same three flow rates. I'll go to a lower soil PCO2. And as you might expect, that knocks us to values of calcium that are too low compared to our expected range, but it improves the radiocarbon because we're not dissolving as much limestone. And finally, the very lowest values of soil PCO2 that we've ever measured above the cathedral room, not getting anything close to enough calcium, matching the radiocarbon. So it is time to give up and find a new site to study. But Jessica, and I have to give her all kinds of credit for this, is tenacious and wanted to figure this out. And she and I spent a lot of time banging our heads against what was going on in this system. I wish I could take you through more of it, but I'll cut to the chase. What I finally wound up appreciating is that, just as a virtue of sort of my background and training in contaminant hydrology, even though I'm simulating this partially water saturated system, I'm still assigning gas phase diffusion values that are more typical of porous media. That is, those diffusion values are low, they're tortuosity corrected relative to the diffusion values for gas, for example, in this room right now. And what I finally came to understand is that the karst in these systems is very fractured. In other words, these systems breathe. The gas phase can move very freely across the karst. It's not that these caves simply breathe through the entryway, they breathe vertically with the upper boundary condition of the atmosphere. And so what I finally realized is that I really needed to open up the ability of gas to move across this karst. And when I did that, this marvelous, huge reservoir known as the atmosphere, abundant in radiocarbon modern CO2, was allowed to interact with the karst and the fluid draining through the karst. And when I allowed that enhanced exchange or movement of gas through the limestone, finally we arrived at a solution where we were getting enough reactivity to dissolve out calcium to values that match the drip water. And we were keeping the radiocarbon of the dissolved inorganic carbon in the system modern enough because of all of that communication with the atmosphere. That was really satisfying when we finally got to this place. And you know, I think I'll just nod to the fact that I'm sure you're thinking, geez, there's a lot of parameters in this model. How do you know that this is right? I'll try and offer one answer to that, and that is that I'm now going to ask exactly the same model to match a new data set without any adjustment. And that is the stable delta 13C isotope composition of this inorganic carbon in the fluid phase. And the only thing I do in order to ask that question is that I assign the constrained fractionation factors for all of the carbon equilibria between all of these different contemporaneous phases across the gas and everybody that exists in the fluid. And so here are some of those fractionation factors. Here are the results from the delta 13C of the model. And you can see that we are indeed getting really good agreement between the range of values that we measure in delta 13C and what we get in calcium and radiocarbon as well. So this made us feel really good about the forward modeling capability that we've been able to develop. So just to kind of drive the point home here, here what I'm showing you is a cross plot of radiocarbon on the x-axis. And if you move to the left, essentially you're getting older. So you're looking at more like limestone. And on the y-axis, this is the stable carbon isotope signature. And so if you go up on this axis, you're moving towards the limestone. If you go down on this axis, you're moving towards that surface organic signature. And what I really wanted to highlight here is that, you know, I wanted to demonstrate the output of this reactive transport model if I simply don't put stable isotope fractionation of those contemporaneous carbonate species into the model. And when we do that, basically delta 13C and delta 14C are just mixing between what's coming from the surface and what's coming from the limestone. And in terms of the radiocarbon, that's okay, right? You can see that on this x-axis, the values that the model is producing are more or less overlapping with the values that we measure in these yellow points. But clearly the delta 13C is wrong. And so when we introduce that equilibria and the fractionation factors that are associated with that equilibria, in particular, allowing distributions in the carbon stable isotope values between the gas phase CO2, the dissolved CO2, the dissolved bicarbonate, and the dissolved CO3, then we get something much closer to what we're measuring. And even still, we actually see some delta 13C values that are more elevated, closer to positive values than what we can encapsulate in the model. And we think that this may actually be a small but not negligible amount of degassing from these fluid drip samples before we actually collect them, potentially evidence for the subset of the drip waters that are actively precipitating and forming that speleothem record. So we're really excited to push this one forward. There's a whole nother paper that's sort of a sister to this paper that's also in review for the trace elements that Jessica led. And you should really get her to come talk to you because she knows this system really, really well. So we use the model to do something for good. And in the last little bit of time that we have here, I just wanted to take, this should actually be 1, 2, and 3, not 4. So I wanted to take one little moment to talk a little bit about the work that I've gotten to fortunately be involved in with your own experts there at the Jackson School, and in particular, Daniela Rempe and Allison Toon, where we're working to understand how weathering reactions proceed in systems where CO2 and the respiration of organic carbon is not just limited to shallow soils. And so we're headed back to California to wrap things up. Probably some of you have seen images like this. If this looks a little bit familiar, it's because this is Daniela's work, not mine. And I just get to come along for the ride and hang out with her, which has been one of the best parts of my research career so far. This is a shale bedrock hill slope in Northern California. It's part of what was the Eel River Critical Zone Observatory in the Angelo Coast Range Reserve, about 3 hours north of San Francisco. And this is the location where Daniela has done a phenomenal amount of work characterizing how fluid is moved and stored across this hill slope, how it sustains vegetation that reaches deep, deep underground below thin, shallow soils, and what this means in terms of carbon cycling and mineral weathering. And Daniela is at the forefront of the installation of this really novel monitoring system that's actually allowing us to collect fluid as it drains vertically through this partially saturated, fractured, weathered bedrock vadose zone. This is Daniela actively installing this monitoring system. This is me not helping. And it's been pretty much that way for a few years now. I get to hang out and work with these fluid samples, and Daniela has really done just a marvelous amount of work to get this thing functioning and starting to develop very novel data sets from it. I'll show you just a little bit that I've gotten to be involved in. This is exactly what you saw in the limestone karst example. Once again, one of the very first things we did is we took drill cuttings from that VMS installation back to the laboratory, and we ran batch dissolution experiments. Again, just trying to constrain the reaction parameters to knock down the number of free parameters that we're going to have to deal with to build a forward model for this system. I just chose 2 solutes. We can look at a variety of different ones, sodium and magnesium, and how they evolve in time in these batch reactions using samples from very deep in the weathering profile, sort of intermediate depth in the weathering profile, and shallow in the weathering profile, all well beneath what you would characterize as soil. Things are looking pretty good. Yes, I'm on a log scale. I'm kind of cheating, but I mean, in general, things are looking pretty good in terms of how these models are recovering this time series of equilibration between fluid and solid phases. Shale is complicated. It is filled with clays that are somehow primary because they're in the bedrock, even though they're not primary because they're recycled. And it's something to try and build these kind of models for a shale. I was feeling good about this until we started getting the solute data from that installation in the hill slope itself. And this is the very same fluid phase solutes at the very same depths as these solid phases were collected were orders of magnitude higher than anything we could generate in the lab. So what you're looking at here in the black line is the mean, and in gray, the variation that we measure in the VMS water samples themselves. This is crazy. I mean, yes, it's pretty well known that there's going to be a discrepancy between reaction rates and reaction progress and what you can do in the laboratory versus what you can do in the field, but it tends to be the other way around. It tends to be that the concentrations and the equilibria that we measure in the field take longer to establish and are often muted compared to what we generate in the lab, because in the lab, you have very high surface areas, you have sort of idealized conditions, you have very high fluid rock ratios, and yet we can't produce anything like the concentrations of solutes that we see in this field. So we were really in a lot of trouble here, and this was a hard one to try and understand, and thank goodness for your very own Allison Toon, because at the same time that we were working with the solutes, Allison was working with the gases. And this is her story to tell. So I'll just point out one cool feature, which is that she's been able to now document persistent and consistent production of CO2, respiration of CO2, organic carbon respiration deep below soils. We're talking like many meters below anything you could call a soil in the rock itself. This is tied to the moisture content of the rock and therefore the openness of the pore spaces to allow oxygen in, which really seals the deal on this oxidative respiration production term. Allison is wrapping up. I have campaigned to Daniela not to sign her thesis so that we can keep her, but I'm afraid that she's going to do it. So you should go to her talk. It's going to be April 30th in your own water, climate, and environment seminar, and she's got a really amazing story to tell. So that's hers. But for my sake, what I learned from Allison is that there's a big production term of carbonic acid deep underground, and that is exactly what I needed. And so this model is essentially now producing the concentration ranges and profiles for the major solutes as a function of depth across the vadose zone, thankfully as a result of the inclusion of a production term of carbonic acid, a PCO2 term, at depth in the model. So this is a really fun demonstration of when and where it's necessary to consider contemporaneous CO2 production and mineral weathering. I'll just take a couple seconds. You might notice that the solute concentrations here are pretty stable pretty quickly as we go through the depth profile. The creek that drains this hill slope is kind of the poster child for what we call chemostasis. In other words, it's been really hard to unpack any variability or dynamics in the development of solutes in this system. And so my own student, John, has been getting really excited about applying isotope ratios to try and deconvolve some of what gets masked in those solute concentrations. And in particular, lithium has become really popular for this application because it's pretty simple. It fractionates if it gets included in the formation of secondary clays, otherwise it doesn't. And vegetation doesn't really cycle lithium. And so this sort of classic boomerang plot has become really popularized as a way to think about lithium isotope fractionation. And if we follow this logic, we think what we ought to see is that in the very shallow fluids, we're dissolving clays, so things are going to be negative in lithium isotopes. As we make new clays, that value is going to get positive, and we're not quite sure what happens when you get into the groundwater. And now John has been able to develop these data sets. So here are lithium concentrations, and very exciting, here are lithium isotope ratios across the VMS weathering profile. And you can see this large shift towards more positive values. We're able to model them using the same forward isotope enabled reactive transport framework. This case, much more complicated than Karst. We have a variety of different clays that contain lithium. Some are dissolving, some are precipitating. They get their own fractionation factors based on the literature, when and where they precipitate. In some locations, one is winning, in other locations, another is winning. And out of all of this dynamic contemporaneous formation and solubilization of mineral phases comes a forward model that predicts this enrichment in the lithium isotope signatures. What's really fun is that this enrichment persists. So what you're looking at in these vertical depth plots is the same as the blue circles in this plot, where we're looking at lithium concentration versus isotope ratio. So you see that enrichment through the vadose zone. It continues to fractionate. It continues to enrich much, much further down into the groundwater, and in particular as we go downhill towards the stream. And ultimately, the stream waters are the most positive values that we measure. Finally, this poster child for chemostasis looks like it's starting to reveal some of its secrets through these stable isotope ratios. And we're really excited to get to track that into the dynamics of solute discharge relationships in these hill slopes. So I have said a lot, and I apologize for the speed, but just to give you an overview, this is our new sort of cartoon that came from mashing those two models, one for carbon respiration and one for mineral solubilization and weathering, into one framework. This is basically what you need in order to put them all together and get carbon to age in these reactive transport models. I am very excited to move forward into specific drips in those cave systems, the diffuse versus the flashy ones, and unpacking their relationship to communication with the surface and the speed at which fluid moves through the karst that feeds each of these individual pathways. And finally, I have ripped off Daniela's conceptual model of the world, which I have been a real fan of and enjoyed signing on to, where we're thinking about these contemporaneous systems of water storage, ecosystem functioning, CO2 generation, and mineral weathering all happening at the same time and in the same places in these hill slopes. So that's everything I have for you, and thank you so much for your attention.
Well, thank you, Jenny. So if you'd like to talk to Jenny more, you can reach out to her. We do not have a happy hour today, but we can organize one at a later date for those interested. So please get in touch with me or Jenny. And thanks so much, Jenny, again for joining us.
Thanks, guys.